So our subject this week relates to the role of audience in contemporary art and how audience become activated in the context of contemporary art by relying on some of the important post-modern theories that we're going to talk about today. As you may remember, we started our first lecture in this class with this communication diagram developed and suggested by Roman Jakobsen. You probably remember that from our first class lecture. So Roman Jakobsen suggested that any form of communication that happens around us would heavily rely on these three important components: the addresser, addressee, and the message. So these are three important components in all different forms of communication, according to Jakobsen. But he also mentioned that, and this is the important part of his theory, he mentioned that the message, as one of those three key components, is heavily based and kind of limited to these three elements: context, code, and channel. We discussed this before. For example, if you are thinking about a painting as a message that is being sent by the artist toward the audience or being received by the audience, that painting has, as a message or as a content or idea that is being conveyed, includes three important key elements. Code, which would be the rules and form and material that shape up that message or that painting, or actually shapes up that content or idea, make it tangible and objective. Channel is the conveyor of that message, the vehicle that artist or adversary puts the message in and sends it to the audience. So every kind of message, they needs a medium, they need a channel in order to be sent through the audience. And that channel or medium is an important part of the message. In art, for example, it would be the discussion of those mediums that we were talking about: painting, for example, sculpture, photography. They all have their own sets of rules and codes. And finally, the context, which is very important, especially in contemporary art, as we are going to see today, is the historical, cultural, and social context of that communication. So it really depends on when, where, and how these communications happen, based on the social values, cultural values of that society that hosts this communication, as we discussed before. However, today we are going to talk about a different form of communication. It is still a form of communication, but it's different than what Roman Jakobsen and modernists had in their mind. It's a form of communication that is being derived out of postmodern thoughts, and we are going to evaluate this new form of communication, which we would rather call it active dialogue, or as we will see today, we would call it relational aesthetic. That's a term, or that's a theory that has been developed by a French thinker. We're going to discuss that today. The thing that happens in the active dialogue is mainly based on the role of these two sides of this spectrum: the artist and audience, or adversary of the message, or the author and receiver, or adversary of the message, or reader. The change of role here doesn't happen in a linear way like this. This is a linear communication. We have one active role and one passive recipient. But here, there is no linear communication available here anymore. The artist or the adversary and the audience or adversary are in active dialogue, constant dialogue situation. So they always send message back and forth to one another. It's just like an active dialogue. So both of them would be considered passive and active at the same time in this context or in this form of communication. So this is the first thing that would change in this diagram: the authorship of two sides of the spectrum. So there is no active or merely active or merely passive role here in this form of communication. The authorship goes away. Both sides, they have authorship, and both sides are recipient of the message. The second thing that happens is activating the content or idea or the message itself. The message becomes liberated from the limitation of rules and forms and materials, and also from the limitation of medium or the media that is going to convey that message. And that's the second important thing that we change beside the authorship. So activation of forms, materials, and also media. We talked about throughout this term, we talked about activation of time, we talked about activation of space, we talked about activation of body. Those are all those rules and forms that used to be important in art and used to be very standardized and specific, but now within this theory, within the contemporary art theory, they are going to be actually dismissed somehow or becoming less important with less influence on the message. The third thing that is changing in this context would be, in this communicational context, would be the role of context as one of the key elements of the message. The context becomes more important than what it used to be. So instead of relying on these two limitations, the context would provide that vehicle that used to be the channel or medium. The space that is going to host that interaction or communication will be heavily distinguished or realized by the social, historical, and cultural value of the society, and also the cultural value that artists and audience are being situated in when they are in dialogue. So I want you to remember these three important changes. I'm going to address them again. They are very important. Three important changes of authorship, activation of the forms and materials, and also the importance of community and the social and cultural context. Before diving into these three changes in contemporary art and showing you some examples that are heavily relied on those three changes that I was talking about in active communication or active dialogue, let's talk about those important historical trends and movements that influenced contemporary art to its highest extent in order to push contemporary art toward that direction, toward the direction of active dialogue and relational aesthetic, as we are going to discuss today. There are some historical benchmarks or historical moments in the history of art that actually facilitates that change or that shift or movement. There are three major benchmarks or hallmarks that we are going to discuss today. The first one would be this movement called the Situationist International Movement, or SI, which started to shape up around 1975, 1978. As you can see here, SI were a group of European avant-garde artists and thinkers, theorists and thinkers, who were making political works designed to shape viewers' passive acceptance as a passive recipient of the message, and change them into an active participant. So that was their main goal. This idea was being generated based on the theories that the spiritual leader of this group called Guy Debord, the French thinker, developed by talking about the political situation in the society during those years. So he claimed that, for the first time, he claimed that the capitalist society is changing its approach or its attitude. He claimed that before these years, throughout the modern era, the capitalist society was heavily relied on the means of production. So they tried to control society, or survey the society, but controlling the means of production in any way from different perspectives. But according to Guy Debord, in contemporary time, the history of his own time, the capitalist society trying to change its approach by shifting or moving its focus from the means of production toward the means of consumption. So now controlling the process of consuming and consumption is more important for the capitalist society to control people than the process of production. Because when they could control the process of consumption and demands in the market, the control of the industrial control and control of production would come with it at the same time. That's why consumption becomes more important according to him. He wrote a book called The Society of the Spectacle. And those of you who are journalism major or media major, you should be familiar with this book. And in that book, he talked about different ways that capitalist society tries to control mass for people. people by relying on this fact related to consumption, by using advertisement, by using, for example, different signifiers in the city, public areas and public spaces in order to control people and push them toward consumption and consuming specific products, actually. So this part that I made it bold is important. That was the core of their belief and practice. And because they gave the more theory was heavily relied on this fact, they started to develop some practices, some in the form of art, creative practice for political movement, activist movement, which was doing this thing that I mentioned here, changing the role of those two sides of the spectrum that I mentioned in previous slides, the adversary and adversary, to make the adversary active rather than passive, to make the adversary a participant rather than recipient, to add engagement into this equation of communication. And that was their main idea for the first time. They used several techniques, as I mentioned, and practices in order to achieve this goal, to subvert the power of capitalist society and media. Most of them relied on liberating the message or media, the message or idea from the influence of media and channel, as we discussed in previous slides. One of those techniques, they called it detournement. You may be familiar with it. You may be familiar with this notion with a different term or via different terminology. We call it today. We call it ad buster or culture jamming, for example, ad bustering or culture jamming. This idea was developed by this group, SI, International. They started to change or subvert the message that consuming culture or the capitalist state intended to send to the audience. They tried to use their own media, their own channel, but somehow modify that channel or that medium in order to subvert the content of it, the message or idea behind it. By changing the billboard, for example, changing the form of advertisement by using appropriation. They call this group of activities detourment, and they try to apply it in society, in public spaces. The other, for example, practice that they had was the idea of lead or drifting, which was another practice. They were gathering one day, for example, during the week, all of the people who were related to this movement, and without any purpose, they were just wandering in the city, without having any direction, without having any limitation. But one important rule, by relying on one important rule, not paying attention to any sign or any advertisement or any billboard or any, for example, laws of direction and movement. They were wandering in the space without paying attention to those signs that usually the capitalist state tries to convey or send through the people in order to control, even according to them, even their movement in the public space are being influenced by governments and also capitalist society. The signs that you would see in the street, the routes that you choose for example, going from your home to your work, for example, and coming back to your school. All of these simple things in public space will be chosen by the capitalist states according to them. And in order to negate that, you need to become a wanderer or a drifter, as they mentioned, by doing this practice. So you would see that their focus was mainly on changing the role of the recipient or the adversary, make it active in the society. The second important hallmark that happened in art was this trend that's called happening. It is kind of like the start point of performance art, which was developed by Alan Cochrane, the famous artist, writer, and thinker, American painter and thinker. He coined this term in 1975, around the same time when SI thinkers in Europe start to become kind of like important in history. They emerged to the surface of the art and also political science. He designed, as you can see here, sets of performances wherein he was